Saying the Mets are feeble right now would honestly be nice to the Mets. They are just pure, unadulterated shit right now. As the Mets have just gotten swept by the Tampa Bay Rays, what once stood as a 5.5 game division lead because the Phillies swept the Blue Jays has now been trimmed to a 2.5 game division lead. And the Mets just got swept by the Rays. This all started when the Mets built up a 5-1 lead against the Rays as the Rays had committed multiple errors in their game against the Mets on Friday. The Rays actually committed 3 errors, and um, um, and the Mets had built up at one point a 95% chance to win the game. However, Mendoza decided to be stupid. He decided to use Paul Blackburn as a long reliever, which horrendously backfired on the Mets. Then Max Kranick, who is not a good pitcher, could not get out of the jam. The Mets lost 7-5. Now, the 2024 Mets are resilient. They've had games where they've blown big leads, but usually they've struck back. However, these Mets were much more feeble. They had a chance to win yesterday until McGill shat the bed in the fourth. The Mets committed 2 errors in this game, and they wound up losing 8-4. And on Friday, just so you know, every single Mets run was unearned. And then today was just a complete embarrassment and a 9-0 loss to the Tampa Bay Rays. Honestly, though, this feebleness really traces back to Thursday, when they were up 4-0 and almost blew the game against the Nationals. The Mets tried to use Stanek. He couldn't get an out as he allowed 3, hits. And Diaz came in, still allowed a hit and a walk before he finally put the game away, at which point, in that game, tying run was on third. And this really, it just goes back to a longer period of struggles. I'm not going to get into how the Mets used to be resilient after blowing games, and, now they're not. But I'm going to more so focus on the aspect of the Mets not really beating good teams. The Mets were at a below 500 pace, ever since April 25th after this horrible game against the Nationals. Before that game, the Mets came in 18-7 with a 5-game lead over the Philadelphia Phillies. And then by the time that slump had ended on May 23rd, they were multiple games behind the Phillies, and they had fallen from 11 over 500 to 9 over 500. So they were in a big slump. The Mets did break out of it, but largely by beating terrible teams. Now the Mets have to face good teams again, and they're getting exposed. At the start of the year, the Mets were beating bad teams. They were beating good teams. They were really dominating at home. That's what you really wanted to see out of the Mets. They did lose the opening series against the Astros, which, a team that started off rough too, but they are a very good team. And then they, had, Marlins, their trash team, but they took 4 out of 6 from them. The Blue Jays in particular, they're a team that is still hanging on to being in playoff position despite the sweep by Philadelphia. The Mets also managed to sweep them. This is how bad the Marlins are doing, by the way. They also managed to sweep them. The Athletics, not a good team. Better when the Mets played them. They're even worse than the Marlins. Mets do take 2 out of 3 in that series. They lose a series against the Twins. They were really bad when the Mets played them, seeing as, they were 7-12, even when the Twins won 2 out of 3. Now the Twins are a 500 team that, while, they aren't exactly in playoff position yet, the Twins have been collapsing recently, but they're still a team that has the potential to go far. Swept the Cardinals. Now, obviously, they're just out of playoff position. Swept the Cardinals. swept the Phillies at home, and they're obviously, chasing the Mets. And, but then you get to this game right here where the Mets get walked off by the Washington Nationals. They had overcome a 3-run deficit just for Stanek to blow it. Just for Stanek to blow it. And then even worse, you have the game on April 27th where the Mets also wind up losing. And how they lost on the 27th was much more gut-wrenching. In that game, first of all, the Mets were up 7-1. In the 7th, they had built up a 99% chance to win just to blow it. And they lost because of a fielding error by Pete Alonso. But at least then the Mets were more resilient. Came back and clapped the Nationals 19-5 the next game. Struggled heavily against the D-backs at home and against the Cardinals on the road. But there's some resilience. Beat the D-backs on the road and then beat the Cubs in a series. There was this aspect of resilience in the Mets back then. In early May. They weren't playing great, but they weren't playing awful too. If you look at the quality of the teams, obviously the D-backs, are just sort of a mid-team, but the Cubs are a very good team. Second best team in the NL behind the Mets, even though the Mets look feeble. Then they play the Pirates. Very ugly games on the 12th and 13th they win, but on the 14th they lose. Terrible series against the Yankees and Red Sox. Dodgers, you have this mess where they are down 5-2 into the 9th, come back just to lose in 13 innings. But then they do win the next couple games. They go on a 4-game win streak and then go on another 4-game win streak before having some rough bumps against the Dodgers. Then they go on a 6-game win streak, but now they've just gotten swept by the Rays. And a lot of this has to do with a lot of aggression by the pitching staff of the Mets in particular. Especially in this game, we really saw a heavy regression out of Griffin Canning, whose ERA is now soared up to 3.8. Everyone was praising Stearns for finding Griffin Canning just for him to transform into a feeble loser. Looking at May 11th, after his dominant outing against the Cubs, he had lowered his ERA to 2.36, and the Cubs are a very hot offense and a very good team, but it got worse after that. Now the Yankees outing wasn't terrible. He gave up 2 runs in 5 1/3, gave up 7 hits, though. That's really a bad sign, but then he had some pretty bad games, like where he only went 2 2/3 against the Dodgers and gave up 3 runs. Granted, that was partially due to a rain delay. Then you have him earning the loss against the White Sox, and his ERA soaring up to 3.23 as he allowed 3 earned runs, 5 total runs in 3 innings pitched. Against the Dodgers, he had a very dominant outing to lower his ERA, but it went right back up when he allowed 4 runs in 5 1/3 innings. It didn't update for the most recent game, but now it's up to 3.8 when you factor that in. 6 earned runs in just 4 1/3. And this is who Griffin Canning really is. This is who he really is. 5.19 ERA in 2024. 4.32 ERA in 2023. 2022, his ERA was 5.6. Oh, 2021. 2020, his ERA was 3.99. In 2019, his ERA stood at 4.58. So Griffin Canning is not a good pitcher. He was pitching very well, but his expected ERAs was much higher than his actuals. And, you look at Griffin Canning's expected ERA before this game, of 4.49, even though his ERA was actually only 3.22, like, it makes sense as to why he's regressing so badly. It's because Griffin Canning was never really a good pitcher. It's just that he had, some lucky outings, and now he's getting exposed for who he really is. Now, McGill we know is bad. I don't think I need to tell any Mets fans that McGill is bad. Clay Holmes, that was bullpen malpractice. Again, he got cute. He should have, in a 4-run game, used high-leverage relievers and actually treat the game seriously. Blown leads like this is always how tailspin starts. In a lot of ways, this is very May 2024-esque out of the Mets. Not going to go into the later part of the season, but, looking at May 2024, and this really starts in April with some of their ugly games, but especially in, May. Diaz blew 4 saves this month, also had plenty of other very rough outings, even though he never actually earned a loss this month. But in this game, it was tied 1-1, top of the ninth. Diaz blows it, but then he has some resilience. But you look at the Rays. In all 3 games, the Mets had a lead at some point, and in all 3 games, they blew them. In this game, Diaz was literally 1 out away from securing the win with no one on, and he allows a home run. So the Mets have actually now lost 6 games in a row to the Rays, which is lovely. But in all 3 games, Mets have a lead. In, the game on May 4th, 2024, and I don't know why I'm going in this order, the Mets had a 1-0 lead. Granted, it was erased immediately. Then you had a 10-8 game where the Mets had a 3-0 lead in the second, only for it to be immediately erased, then fall behind 9-3, and then try to come back and inevitably fail to. But it's like at one point they had an 80% chance to win the game, and they blew it. And then the game on the 5th was the most frustrating, as the Mets literally had at one point a 95.4% chance to win. Literally down to the final out. And then they even take the lead in extras just to blow it 7-6. So, that was horrendous. Showed some resilience against the Cardinals, but then you have this just terrible stretch of games for the Mets. I think that there was literally a point where, you look at a stretch of 15 games, they won 4 of them. They literally won, in a stretch of, 19 games, they won 4 of them. 19 games, they won 4. They were losing horrible games. This game had a 2-1 lead after 8, blew it. This game, even though they won, had a 4-3 lead in the 9th, blew it. This game, 9-5 lead middle of the 9th, blew it. That was the worst that it got. This game, they led 3-0 at one point, blew it. This game, led 6-2 after 7, blew it. This game led 2-1 after 8, blew it. This game led 2-0 after 6 or 7, blew it. Like, this is very May 2024-esque, where the Mets would lose games and then just be feeble losers after that and not recover, not do what they need to do, and continue to play terribly. This is probably the worst the Mets have looked, really, since their stretch at late July, early August. And in both cases, it's similar. Singer got injured on June 12th, and the Mets have struggled since. Singer got injured on July 26, 2024, and the Mets went into a tailspin after that. They lost the next 2 games to the Braves to be unable to win the series, including getting shut out by just a terrible, terrible pitcher in Schwallenbach. Or not terrible, but definitely mid. Then they fell out of playoff position by July 31st. Then they had an absolute tailspin. It was sort of like 500 in 12 games just to go on a 4-game losing streak. This is the worst that the Mets have played in a series since the Mariners, or at least the worst they've played in a, when you consider the fact this is the first time they got swept since the Mariners in 2024. Whereas it's like sort of at least against the Yankees series, as much as the Mets got, I think, more outplayed in that series, at least they managed to squeak in a win on the 17th, even though they lost badly on the 16th and 18th. Then against the Athletics, another series loss. The Mets during this time lost a series to the Angels. They lost a series to the Mariners. They lose another series to the Athletics. This was a blown 5-run lead. Eventually, the Mets would start to get their shit together, but not before this game where they were already 4 games out of playoff position. And this is another just horrendous blown game, 5-4 after 7, and the Mets blew it. So that was certainly a very ugly time for the Mets. They were, below 500 in a long stretch as well, but then, the Mets got jolted and they got a huge win streak in September. May have had a rough stretch at the end of the season, but they at least made the playoffs. Now, for 2025, it's much dicier. Because looking at the wild card standings, obviously the Mets only have a 2.5 game lead on Philadelphia, who has a 3 game lead on the Padres for the final wild card spot. And the Brewers are 1 game back, seeing as they won. So the Mets lead in the postseason, I think before it was 7.5. Now it's shrunk to 6.5. They have a 6.5 game lead to make the playoffs. On the one hand, that is pretty comfortable. And you do realize that even if the Mets blow it to the Phillies, they also have to blow it to the San Francisco Giants, San Diego Padres, and then the Brewers, or maybe, Cardinals, D-backs could slip in there. The Mets have the tiebreak against the Cardinals. Against the D-backs, they split 3-3, so that's sort of TBD. And there's a lot of teams that, just right below there that the Mets could fall behind. That, just got to hope that they don't. But for the division, at least, is not comfortable. And for the wild card, it's still not as comfortable as you want. If the Mets go at a 500 pace for the rest of the season, 551 win pace for the Pods over 162, that's an 89 win pace. 534 win pace over 162, now that's an 86 win pace. So I'm going to say the 89 was more reliable. You're going to need 89-ish wins to make the playoffs this year. So like in the National League last year, how you needed 89 wins to make it, seeing as the Mets with the 6th seed. So if the Mets play 500 ball for the rest of the year, yes, they'll sneak into the playoffs. But this is a team that should be out there winning a championship and winning the division and going on a deep playoff run. This is not the kind of team where it's acceptable to really settle for, sneaking into the playoffs. It's just not. And if they go at a 500 pace, then that's what's going to happen. But are the Mets even capable of going at a 500 pace? Their pitchers are getting badly exposed. Their managers and their front office are getting badly exposed. Their offense was never really that good this season. Are the Mets really going to be able to, come back and turn this around? I genuinely don't think so. Because the matchup for the Braves looks very unfavorable. I think people are predicting the Mets to lose 2 out of 3. Probably losing 2 out of 3 against the Philadelphia Phillies too. That's a 2-7 stretch in 9 games. And then they get to play the Braves again. Hopefully the matchups are more favorable. The Braves are not a good team. They are 31-39. But if the matchups are favorable, and the Mets are struggling heavily right now, then that doesn't really matter. Again, you look at the quality of teams the Mets have played, and not great. Really not great. Because again, ever since they started to struggle, you look at good teams over 500, they lost a series to the D-backs, but then won a series against the D-backs, but lost a series against the Cardinals. So 4-5 against teams over 500. Won a series against the Cubs, 6-6. Lost a series to the Yankees. They are, now at 7-8 against teams over 500. And now that the Red Sox have climbed above 500 after they swept the Yankees, now you put them into the mixture, 8-10. Won a series against the Dodgers, so that does put them at 10-11. And then split the 4 games, so that's 11-12. Now they got exposed by the Rays, though. Now they're, I think, 11-15 against teams over 500. They might have been, climbed more games above 500, but the Mets can't just rely on feasting off the Nationals and the Rockies and the White Sox and Pirates, the pad games. The Mets don't play the Rockies anymore. They play the Pirates, but they play them in Pittsburgh, where it's going to be a lot harder for the Mets to be as dominant against the Rockies. They play the Nationals. They play once more in Nationals Park, which has always been tough for the Mets. And then they play the Nationals again in Citi Field at the end of the year. That's at least good. And they at least get to pad against the Marlins at the end of the year, but not before playing the Cubs at Wrigley. The Mets still have not played the San Diego Padres yet at all. Or the San Francisco Giants. Still have another series to play against the Yankees. Although at least that one's at Citi Field. But does it really matter? They've had a huge home field advantage, but their first sweep of the year was at Citi Field. I think that this Mets team is just not built to be as good as it is, and I think that this is going to be a disappointing season. And I think the Rays really exposed the Mets for the frauds that they are.